BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hi, I'm Gemma Kearney and you're listening to Don't You Forget About Me. I've been joyously digging through the archives to bring you some of the best, unforgettable music documentaries that you might have missed. In my opinion, this one is most definitely deserving of another spin, so just relax, enjoy, press play on this absolute gem.
Now on Radio 4, the musician and composer Matthew Herbert presents The Art of the Loop. 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 The Art of the Loop.
Hello, I'm Matthew Herbert. I make most of my music by taking everyday sounds and manipulating them, finding the musical elements within them, and turning them into something new. At the heart of that process is the creation of repetitive sound samples, or looping. To me, looping is a fundamental aid to creativity, and most modern music, from experimental jazz to chart pop, features some element of looping. Technology is changing the way we compose and create, and making the process accessible to far more people. But along the way, are we losing originality and artistic independence?
40 years ago, people had to go to incredibly elaborate lengths to achieve this. Now, of course, you can do it on a telephone. You can do this stuff while you're sitting on the bus.
I mean, even if you were playing with Lego, you'd be a bit gutted that you only used 4 bricks. It's a bit like the equivalent of being really happy with making a house out of 4 bricks.
In the short time we have together, I want to show you how repetition and looping is central to music and the way we think.
My name is Dr. Daniel Glaser. I'm Director of Science Gallery London, which is at King's College London, and a new space where art and science collide. Music as a form, as a cultural form, is quite structured. So it's got its own patterns and its own cultural norms. So when you listen to music, it's not a raw sound form, but it's something which you're hearing in the context of what you know. When it comes to looping and repeating, the first thing to say is that your auditory system, the bit of your brain that does hearing, is much more sensitive to loops than your visual system. So if you were trying to explore a structure, a thing that had repeating patterns, you'd be wanting to use your ears rather than your eyes. Almost if you were walking past some railings, running a stick along them, you could almost imagine closing your eyes and listening to the rhythm of the stick. Seeing the stick bouncing along the railings wouldn't be as interesting as hearing it. So your auditory system is particularly interested in repeating patterns and repetition and looping as an intrinsic property of the oral world, the things that we hear. And in the brain, there are loops, there are circuits that go round, there are repeating patterns of neural activity. All circuits in the brain rely on repetitive firing, the firing of neurons for their function. Cells fire, they fire in patterns, and the pattern of their firing is the substrate for thought. When it comes to loops and repetition, humans are amateurs, birds are the professionals. The rhythmicity of birdsong and the repetition of birdsong is intrinsic to communication, but the rhythms and the repetitions of birdsong are imperceptible to us at normal speed. You can only fully appreciate them if they're slowed down. Compared to birds in the sense of the subtlety, the density, and the variation in repetition, humans are far behind.
Let me turn this off.
Art of the Loop. The Art of the Loop. The Art.
Technology, of course, means I can work almost anywhere, but most of the time I'm here in a studio not far from the sea in Kent. It's home to a variety of musical and recording equipment, from antique harmoniums to the latest digital samplers and effects. I'm surrounded by equipment that I can use to manipulate sound. So I did an album called One Pig, which was made out of a pig's life from start to finish. And one of the recordings I had whilst recording the pig was a tractor going past. and there you can hear a sheep in the background. So you can just then play it as a sample on a keyboard. And then you start to notice that the pitch that's in there. You can start to hear the combination of the sheep and the tractor start to develop quite a clear harmony. This is what it ends up as. By being able to loop and to pause or to record little sections of real sounds and record things that go past in our lives, looping allows you to listen to that aspect of your environment in a completely different way and to think about the stories it might contain. I definitely don't know the sounds that I'm looking for. You can't predict what's going to be there. If you knew what was going to be there, you probably wouldn't need to go in the first place. For me, it's about telling the story, so I was interested in telling the story of a single life from birth to death. And it happened to be a farm animal, and it happened to be on a farm that was near to me. And so, for example, when I set out to record this pig's life, I wasn't necessarily intending on recording a tractor or a sheep. So on this track, for example, all the keyboard noises are made out of a cow. A really lush, warm, slightly ethereal sound. It's just the sound of one cow lowing in the next door stable, pitched down or pitched up an octave or two. And again, I was not expecting to record a cow, but it was an amazing part of the texture, and an opportunity came. For me, there's a fundamentally important philosophical journey about recording that is to do with not just letting everything just rush by, but actually being able to stop and think and just listen. I think the art of listening is something that has long abandoned us, or we've abandoned it over the last few years. We're surrounded by so much music, so much noise, and yet there's so many amazing things that's happening just going past, whether it be in a footstep or a voice or a cow lowing or a pig grunt. Part of what's exciting to me about working with sound and then chopping it up and looping it, listening to it again and again, is it starts to affect your perception of the world. 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 Some of what I'm talking about may sound very modern or avant-garde, but the principles of looping go back to music's earliest roots. Chris Sharp programmes contemporary music events at the Barbican in London and is fascinated by the way that repetition is core to music.
All kinds of sacred music, Christian sacred music, Islamic sacred music, African kind of ritual music, absolutely are all about repetition and slow change.
Looping as a phrase is a relatively recent word. Certainly in classical music you would have sections that are repeated. So the orchestra might play a 16-bar figure and then repeat it once more before moving on to the next figure.
The most obvious example is something like Beethoven's 7th Symphony, which does repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat with slow change. As somebody who had grown up listening to, techno and house and hip hop and stuff like that, hearing that piece made me think, wow, those people totally got the idea of a groove, effectively.
After the war, and with the invention of means to create more mechanical or electronic music, the transfer of the reproduction of music started to be taken on by machines. We started to outsource, if you like, part of the performance. looping became a very important early tool in electronic music because there wasn't the ability to generate scales according to pitch in the way that we assume now. So, for example, in the radiophonic workshop, what they used to do was record a sine wave at a particular tone onto a tape, make it up into a loop, and then speed the tape up, and then splice it all together, and then record that onto another tape, and then keep going until you had a complete set of scales and the ability to create pitch. And so actually the tape loops were a really crucial part of the compositional process. For me, one of the greatest pieces of music of the 20th century is Come Out to Show Them by Steve Reich.
I had to open the bruise up and let some of the blues blood come out to show them.
Steve loops the phrase "come out to show them."
Come out to show them, come out to show them, come out to show them, come out to show them.
He set two tape machines going, one running slightly faster than the other, both playing the exact same recording.
Come out to show them, 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 come out to show them.
It takes about 20 minutes until it becomes this absolutely sort of celestial blur of sound.
What he was interested in was starting to hear the musicality and the shifts in texture and timbre that happened.
Of course, when Reich and others who were interested in, as it were, mechanistic repetition in the late 60s and early 70s, they had no access to any of the equipment that musicians have now. You know, there was no such thing as a sampler. The only way of recording was on magnetic tape, and the only way to record long loops was to use very long pieces of magnetic tape. So it was absolutely typical for people like Steve Reich, or even Gavin Bryars with his famous pieces like Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet, which is a hugely long loop of a tramp singing under Waterloo Bridge that Gavin Bryars recorded in the early 1970s.
Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he loved me so.
You know, they had to string these huge, long, physically long loops of tape, you know, held up on bits of pencils hanging off desks and bits of wood kind of sticking out of bookcases so that they didn't get tangled as they revolved around a whole room. So, yeah, quite a lot of ingenious technological solutions had to be found to realise these kind of artistic impulses.
It wasn't really until computers started to take over and music started to take on a much more rigid form, in a sense that things were much more categorized according to grids. And so in many ways the technology started to determine how we would use it and started to determine the feel of music. So for example, if you listen to Kraftwerk, it's very rigid and very precise, adhering very precisely to a 4/4 grid.
We are programmed just to do anything you want us to. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots. We are the robots.
Sort of jumping back a bit, I mean, when I first started, music computers weren't even around, and certainly it's not really until the last couple of years where they've been stable enough to base a whole live show on. So we were using technology that wasn't always designed for that purpose. The sampler I always took on stage was an Akai 612, which was the first sampler Akai ever made. All the functions that went on inside could be accessed just with knobs and levers and buttons on the front, so there wasn't any fancy internal menus or programming. And consequently, I still think it as having an incredibly logical interface. So, for example, if we just record something in, the art of the loop. The art of the loop. The art of the loop. So as you can hear, it was pretty extreme, even for back then, but there was just a glorious naivety to it. The people that design it don't really know what the end people are going to do with it. And what happened in the 90s was that the manufacturers noticed what people were doing with it and then altered their technology to fit people's expectations or how they were using it. So consequently, it's like a kind of closed loop where gradually it closes down the circle of possibilities. And what's great about that first sampler is that you can just produce really original sounds just by plugging in a microphone at the front and taking a sample, and off you go. Go. Today I'm using Logic, which was a piece of software developed again in the 90s really, and it was a very intricate and geeky but professional piece of software used for making music.
The musician and composer Matthew Herbert presents The Art of the Loop.
So when you first listen to that, you obviously just hear it as a piece of audio. If you just cycle or loop around a little part of it, it soon starts to sound quite alien, and then it starts to sound musical. So for example, if I listen to this,
Musician and composer,
you can start to hear in her voice the little. So if we start to amp up those little crispy bits at the top.
and commission 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 and commission.
You can start to hear a little. That's the really interesting thing about looping in the sort of modern sense of the phrase, is that just within very small fragment of audio you can discover all sorts of things. And I think from that sense, philosophically, there's a really interesting aspect to looping which allows you to press pause on the world somehow and to just keep replaying that one moment and seeing what new things you can discover in there.
The art of the loop. The art of the loop.
You get do. It starts to be a little musical phrase. You know, it's not hard to hear that as being a sung phrase.
The art of the loop. The art.
So that's now, I've put that into a sampler. So what that's done is the computer's gone through and it's found all the peaks in her phrase and it's chopped them up and applied them to different notes.
The art of the loop.
And then you can start quantizing it, which means making it adhere much more precisely to the grid.
The art of the loop. The art of the loop. The art of the loop.
Now stand up straight with your arms outstretched for the 1 foot balance. Stand up tall.
Hey, I'm DJ Yoda, and you're listening to The Art of the Loop on BBC Radio 4.
Touch your toes.
I think loops are kind of a really essential part of what I do because I have a background in hip-hop, and that's what hip-hop is built on. The whole aesthetic of making music to me starts with a loop.
Flip off your shoes. Stand with your feet. Both feet are flat on the floor.
So we've come to Berwick Street in Soho in London, to one of the last remaining record shops where you can actually dig around for samples and loops. It used to be the case 10 or 15 years ago that all the DJs would come around this area and there'd be tons of places to go, but that kind of all goes on online now. So this is one of the last remaining places that you can go for this kind of thing, and I'm going to start to have a flick through some records. Okay, so I've gravitated straight towards this section that says soundtracks, comedy and kids, because that's my kind of thing. Sing Something Simple. That looks quite interesting. Okay, so I'll just try it on the first track.
Sing something simple with words I know.
It's not boding well. No, the vocals are really horrible. So there's a bit over here we're saying mid-price soundtracks, shows, comedy, spoken word and rock as well. So that sounds like there could be some interesting stuff for me. Oh, that's an amazing record. Like, it's so good that I'm actually going to buy it. All right, so this is called Strictly for Grown-Ups by Paddy Roberts, and it's a comedy record from, I'm guessing, the 50s. But there's a song on it called The Big DJ. So it doesn't sound like it's going to be something that's interesting to a hip-hop DJ, but wait.
I'm a disc jockey, remarkably cocky, with every good reason to be. And I'll say it, though maybe I oughtn't. I'm really most frightfully important. All the teenagers, though simply outrageous, believe every word that I say. I get the new records as soon as they're in, then pick out the ones that create the most din, and the fools go and buy everything that I spin. I'm the big DJ, the big DJ.
The art of the loop.
There was a fundamental shift in the 80s, which allowed people like me to be able to start to buy things like samplers and recording equipment. There's a real democratisation of access to the technologies in the 90s. And that threshold, if you like, of gaining entry to that form of music making has dropped even further, to the point now where you can get free and very cheap applications that run on your phone, even trimmed down versions of professional programs that allow you to do very much the same thing for under £1. So it's extraordinarily widely available now, and slightly leads to a preponderance of, or an excess of music. There's now such a high turnaround of music. I think it's hard to separate that from the means of production. If you open up a program such as Logic, it offers you some options as soon as you start. So the first thing it asks is, would you like to compose? And I'm going to say yes. Then it has different options. It says empty project, electronic, hip-hop, R&B, rock, songwriter. So let's put electronic. And then what it does, it loads up all sorts of things. That says, reading from the top, it says classic techno kit, so it's preloaded a drum kit for me. Then it's preloaded me loads of synthesizers, a bass line, it says clubby velocity chords. So it's loaded that in already, so it thinks that I want to play a minor chord with one note with a load of delay on it and a bit of reverb. It's got a 16th chord ensemble. So it thinks that I want to write that. And then over here you have a loops window, so let's click electronic. Here we go, what would you like? Let's try 80s dance bass synth 2. Let's find some bass. Right, and some drums. Let's have some club dance beat 7, why not? Strings, it says here. What about strings? Let's have Middle Eastern Oud 2. Then we've got a Nordic keyed fiddle. It tells you on the right, like, what's... So as you can see, I haven't played a single note. I haven't pressed anything other than I've made some selections, and I've managed to produce a piece of dreadful music in under 30 seconds. I think it's really important that we make distinctions about what we're doing. So me just grabbing little bits of music that someone else has made and just pasting it together, to me, is a very different process to writing an orchestral symphony with a pencil and paper. And we use this phrase music, and yet we don't really have proper distinctions between that. We're both composing music. Well, I don't necessarily think that's true. And so I think there's obviously merit in this. I would argue quite how much merit is up for grabs, but there is obviously merit to it. It certainly gives people with musical ideas that without necessary music training or access to resources an opportunity to express themselves. And in that sense, it has to be a good thing. That's a loop called Vintage Funk 3. And then this is, you might recognise this.
Rihanna. You have my heart, and we'll never be worlds apart. Maybe in magazines, but you still be my star, baby. 'Cause in the dark, you can't see shit.
So there we go. A #1 record just made with a beat that's just a free loop or something. Looping may be almost ubiquitous and easily accessible, but some people are still doing imaginative and creative things with it. For me, one of the best is the British musician Jamie Liddell, who uses samples of his own voice to create backing tracks for his songs, performs live with loops and samples. He's now based in Nashville, Tennessee.
I love the new part of the Technology is definitely not the problem. Technology is definitely very open, and there's many, many options available to everyone. But I think a good bit of chaos is, if people don't know the feeling of chaos, they ought to definitely try it. Loop. I mean, I went over the street. There's like a kid that lives over the street. You know, he's a young guy, but he was using GarageBand, you know, which I guess has informed all of those decisions with Logic. And he was like, I've been making music. And he played me this stuff, and it actually sounded kind of, you know, impressive in a way. I was like, oh man, good work, you know. And then he showed me how it was done, and I was like, oh, it's a bit depressing, you know. It's definitely like, I mean, even if you were playing with Lego, you'd be a bit gutted that you only used 4 bricks. It's a bit like the equivalent of being really happy with making a house out of 4 big bricks, and then just claiming that was, you know, architecturally valid. I mean, ultimately, using small samples is just like using very small Lego bricks, and then building something, you know, resembling a house, rather than just huge chunks prefabricated. I mean, it's the equivalent of prefab housing, isn't it?
In the end, looping and samplers are no different from any other musical instrument or piece of equipment. What is important is the imagination and craft in creating something unique. Increasingly, though, the technology is taking those choices out of our hands, guiding us down increasingly narrow and conservative paths. Set against a turbulent, shifting world, instead of encouraging us to press pause and reflect, looping in music has guided us to an unhealthy state of permanent recycling, the seduction of the familiar, drawing us away from the impulse to change.
The art of the loop. 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 The art of the loop.
Find more amazing music documentaries just like this by searching for Don't You Forget About Me in the BBC Sounds app.